So thank you for a fantastic start to the morning, Natalie. Our next keynote speaker is Elena Bennett, who's a professor at McGill University, and she's the co-chair of the Future Earth Global Research Project called Ecoservices, and she's going to be speaking about managing working landscapes for multiple ecosystem services.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. As someone who doesn't normally work on climate and climate change, I learned so much yesterday, and a lot this morning too. And I'm going to build, hopefully, on the optimism and what was it, optimism and radical collaboration, and a little bit on hopefully where Natalie left off. That was a really inspiring talk. So thank you so much. Before I get to my radical optimism, though. We started this morning, and we're talking about this two sides of the coin, whether that's biodiversity or ecosystem services or human well-being, and climate. And Sandra made the point that it's not just climate solutions that are good for human well-being, but maybe human well-being efforts to improve human well-being that can be beneficial to climate. And I want to sound a note of radical non-optimism before I get to my radical optimism, which is just to say that we have decades of evidence that it doesn't work that way, even though we have in our heads the sense that that's where we have to look for the solutions. The solutions are going to have to be things that both improve human well-being and are good climate solutions. But we have a lot of evidence that points to the fact that everything we've done thus far to improve human well-being has been quite destructive for our natural ecosystems. So, we can all be Don Quixote riding off into the sunset, maybe. Okay, so now I'm going to move from my radical unoptimism to radical optimism, and my goal is to talk to you a little bit about working landscapes, which are landscapes that are dedicated primarily, the way I think about them, to providing a single ecosystem service. So that might be a mining landscape, a forestry landscape where we're extracting timber, might be a fisheries seascape. And I'm going to focus mostly today on agricultural landscapes because that's the one that I know best. And I was thinking last night about how I could build on the challenges and opportunities that we heard yesterday, and I started writing things down that jumped out at me. So we heard, for example, that we're doing a lot but not fast enough. Chris talked to us about the need to find an accelerator pedal. We talked a lot also about the fact that we're not always paying attention to the important trade-offs, whether those are trade-offs across systems or across services or across benefits. Because of those trade-offs, we talked about the fact that co-benefits are important, or maybe even co-benefits are everything. That's where we want to look for these solutions. We heard about the fact that changes in disturbance frequency and intensity are increasing the likelihood of abrupt changes in ecosystems and all the problems that and challenges that implies for our efforts. We learned that all of these systems that we're working in are very complex systems, and that the dynamics of those complex systems make it really difficult to predict the results of our actions and when, for example, our nature-based solutions are likely to work, or how we can design them to make them more likely to work. We also talked, especially in the small groups, about how high-level goals are devolved to nations to make the actual changes, but who's coordinating? Who's making sure that the action taken in one place isn't causing a trade-off or a problem in another place or for another group of people? We heard that the cost of solutions at scale is sometimes enormous, and that the people who can afford to pay those costs are the people who are benefiting from the very system that we have right now and are not very likely to want to pay for that, and that those who are hurting the most from this might not be able to implement the kind of changes that we need. And all of that, I guess I'm still in radical unoptimism mode, aren't I? All of that made me think, what can we learn from success stories, and what could I talk about today? And I'm going to focus in mostly on one on-the-ground project where we looked at how managing for multiple ecosystem services in a working landscape could address challenges just like these. Okay, so why? Let me start first with why is this important? And I just want to say, I think we're pretty good in agricultural landscapes at this, managing them for a whole lot of food, a single service. We use technology and intensification. All of our economic incentives point in the direction of making these working landscapes be very intensified and good at producing one service. And not so good at where I think we need to be down here with producing multiple services that are good for the human well-being of multiple different groups of people. And that's fine, but the problem is that being in that upper top right corner, that's really only good for some people temporarily in times of great stability. And otherwise, it foreshadows a great decline in ecosystem services and ultimately in human well-being. So in times of change, which we just heard we're in, when co-benefits matter, when we're in complex systems, we have to instead be thinking about managing for resilience, for adaptability, for uncertainty. And by uncertainty, I mean both the known unknowns, the stuff we know we don't know, and the unknown unknowns, the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know yet. And that puts us down here in this corner where finding a way to manage our working landscape so that they provide multiple services is incredibly important. Okay, so let me talk about why I'm going to focus in on agriculture a little bit this morning. So first of all, when we look at the food production chain, so everything all the way from production to the consumer, that chain is emitting 12 gigatons of CO2 per year, which is a little over 20% of all the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a really important system to be thinking about when we're thinking about climate. And if we break that down and just look at farms, because I'm going to veer off into just looking at what's happening on the landscape, because I'm a landscape ecologist, we see that the 570 million farms on the world are producing about 61% of that food system's annual emissions. So farms are an important part of the problem and therefore an important part of the solution. And we saw this yesterday. Farms cover a great deal of land area, about 30% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. That about doubles if we include all of the livestock and pasture land. So this covers a massive amount of Earth's ice-free terrestrial surface. And it's a very important threat. So if we're trying to think about both human well-being and climate, we know that we have somewhere between 1 in 7 and 1 in 10 hungry. We know that agriculture is probably our single biggest cause of environmental degradation, an important cause of climate change that I just pointed out. And we're anticipating needing to double food production by approximately 2050. So we face some pretty serious challenges in agriculture. I've been really inspired lately by listening to Johan Rockström and some of his group talk about how the fact that we've had this exponential increase in problems that we see when we talk about the great acceleration, that we should also be thinking about exponential increases in solutions. Why shouldn't our solutions work exponentially in the same way that we cause problems? And they have laid out just in the last few weeks in this exponential climate action roadmap how they imagine that we could have carbon emissions on an annual basis. So how could we just keep reducing by half, by half, by half, and therefore get to an exponential decline? And they show this first halving by 2030 that could come from, and have modeled out how this could come from a mixture of, this is for agriculture only, a mixture of sustainable agriculture, agroforestry, precision ag, farmland restoration, forest management, and peatlands and wetlands. And they've modeled out that will take 3 different kinds of things. So one, climate leadership, by which they mean divestment, global agricultural alliances between business, government, and farming organizations. It will take policy, top-down government, putting money behind finding win-wins, and it's going to take the use of technology to help reduce the friction between places where we need behavioral change and where behavioral change is painful. Okay, so all that said, globally, I want to drill down to a really specific example on the ground of how we've made this work, because I think, as Natalie pointed out, it's really hard for us to know when solutions work or how they work or what we can do to make this work. And so this is work that I did in a community just outside of Montreal. So the gray island there, if I do the right one, is Montreal, and we were working in this region out here that sits between the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York and Vermont and the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec. And the communities there had a few $1 million from the government to protect and restore forest patches in the landscape. And what they were interested in was restoring the right forests that would get them multiple benefits. So they wanted to know which forests can we restore that will allow different species to move to adapt to climate change, which forests can we restore that are going to get us the most economic benefit. And we came in and said, okay, but can we also help you understand which forests are going to get you the most ecosystem services off of this landscape, more recreation, more carbon storage, more of other things that you want in addition to just this adaptation to climate change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this as a solution. I'll stop and hit on some of the challenges that we faced in doing this too. I think that's fair, because the challenges talked about yesterday talked a lot about opportunities and solutions. So I'll flip it around just a little bit. Okay, so we worked, and I should point this out, this was a partnership project with 13 mayors and the prefect of this county, and all land use planning in Quebec is done at the county level. So every mayor has a dedicated land use planner, and the prefect has a dedicated land use planner, and they're working across this whole county to design a landscape management that makes sense across the county. And we're recognizing here that that all forest fragments aren't created equal. And this partnership, I think, with these mayors represents a real opportunity, because we could develop the solutions in the presence of the people who are going to be responsible for implementing them. So instead of just coming up with a solution and handing it off and saying, this is what we think you should do, and then having the mayors say, that's completely unrealistic, we were able to work with them directly in quarterly meetings about what we were finding to find out whether this was actually going to be a workable solution for them. It's also a massive challenge. I mean, it took us a year before we even had funding to work out what the right questions were that were scientifically interesting, for which the scientists on this project could generate and graduate graduate students, and that the mayors were actually interested in at the same time. So. And it was challenging in other ways too. For example, we had an election mid-project where half of our mayors turned over to another set of mayors, and we all of a sudden had to bring new people onto the project and get their buy-in, regardless of what political party they were from and whatnot. So lots of opportunities, I think, in this very on-the-ground work, and lots of challenges as well. Okay, and so like I said, the mayors and their land use planners were very interested in protecting these forests. So you see these forests that exist at the end of our agricultural fields mostly for biodiversity purposes. And one of our goals was to get them to think about all of the other benefits that they're getting from those landscapes as well. So could we get them to think about the food production, the deer hunting, the maple syrup, the carbon storage, the climate regulation, and the aesthetic beauty. This is an area where a lot of people are going to hike and recreate and experience nature. We wanted them to think about how they're designing their whole landscape to get different mixes of services, and what they could do to essentially adjust the petals on these diagrams of pulling out petals to get more benefit, more services, and hopefully without incurring too many trade-offs and loss of other services, by designing their landscapes to look like different things. did this by measuring a whole bunch of stuff in the present. We looked also at the past, at a 40-year history of services and land use change in the region. And then we worked with these mayors and with all of our constituents, actually, to design scenarios for the future and try to understand what kinds of decisions they expected to be facing in the next 10 to 20 years, and how our models could help them understand the mixes of different services that they would get in those different situations. I won't say too much about the things that we measured, except to say that we tried to span the whole distance from looking at just what the land use and land cover was like, and not just amounts, but the configuration, because we know in this case that the mayors were very interested in which forests and where, and not just how much forest. Measuring biodiversity, ecosystem function, and ecosystem services, so trying to capture that whole frame all the way through. We did that with a veritable army of students on the landscape who measured an awful lot of things out on that landscape that we were able to pull together into some sort of roadmap for these mayors. I'm just going to present one little piece of result that's particularly relevant to the climate story in this. This was work done by Carly Zeter. And so what I'm showing is functional diversity on the x-axis and carbon sequestration on the y-axis in managed forests in the red and unmanaged forests in the blue. And managed, I should be clear in this landscape, managed, these are forest patches at the end of individual property owners' farm fields. So these are managed for maple syrup or for a small amount of fuel wood to heat homes in the winter. And this to me is like, it's the ultimate win-win-win for services and climate. Because if you have an unmanaged forest, what we find is that the higher biodiversity you have in these unmanaged forest patches, the more carbon storage you get. We get the opposite relationship for managed forests. That is, in managed forests, the more biodiverse, the less carbon storage. But it doesn't matter, because in the managed forest, you always have more biodiversity and carbon storage than you have in the unmanaged forest, until you get way out on this end. We think that what's going on here is when the farmers are managing, they're managing for maple trees, because those are the ones they prefer to burn, and those are the best, obviously, for maple syrup, which is a very dense wood and therefore stores more carbon. But we get this nice win-win picture off of our landscape. We're then able to take all of those results, so results for carbon storage, for pest regulation, for recreation, every other of a dozen different ecosystem services that we're managing on this landscape, and build it into a sort of what-if machine, which is a model that our mayors and land use planners can then use to say, what if? What if we protect these forests instead of those? What if we focus on the forest that'll get us good recreation? If we do that, what's our economic development like? What's our carbon storage like? And we worked with these stakeholders to develop the kinds of scenarios that they were interested in, and then predict for them, both visually in these artist-drawn images, but also in quantitative modeled results of ecosystem services, what kinds of outcomes they would get. So for example, here from a development scenario, which was some of our stakeholders were very fond of, a dramatically increased development and suburbanization where they could bring in a lot of telecommuters. You know, what happens in that circumstance for ecosystem services? Or what happens if they decide that greening and hedgerows should be restored, and we should really be thinking about connectivity in this landscape? We're able to model for them also the sorts of ecosystem services that they would get in those situations. And I'm gonna skip through those two and just come back to the challenges and opportunities. Just to say that I think my experience with this, working in the Montérégie, this area outside of Montreal, tells me that I think we can do a lot with these first five challenges by taking this sort of ecosystem services or nature-based solutions approach. It does help us to move faster. It helps us to pay attention to trade-offs and multiple benefits at the same time, those co-benefits. It is helping us to think about how disturbances are going to influence this region and to deal with these complex system dynamics by taking this sort of scenario development approach. I think it's also somewhat useful at those bottom four challenges that we started off with about high-level goals being devolving or the costs of solutions or the people who pay, but maybe somewhat less so until we start to look at something like what Natalie's doing or looking across multiple different efforts to bring these services together and coordinating. But I do think that this is a way, ecosystem services as a framework is a way for us to think forward through some of the really important challenges that came up yesterday. Thanks.
Hi, that was a great talk. Thank you. I'm just wanting to know whether you're sort of placing your very localized study into sort of like a national framework, so looking at scaling up. I'm kind of really keen to know what the answer was as well. Which of those two landscapes was delivered most benefits and was economically viable? But also, is it scalable? Is the work you're doing and the models you're developing, which sound really cool, are they scalable nationally? Do you think?
Yeah. So let me answer both of those questions. So the answer to the second question, which is which of those is better, is that there really isn't a clear answer. There isn't one way that is good for everyone and all services. So, really sort of forces people to think about what they really want, what they really value at base. And I think, to me, this is also part of why it's so important to work directly with our actors in this situation, is that, there's not some guy with his hand on the light switch over there that I can just give him the right information and he's going to make the right decision. It's a really complicated situation where people are, it's through conversation about what do you want, what do you want, what are you willing to give, that ultimately the decision gets made. And in these cases, it's really complicated because it's not just public land, it's private land, it's a big mix. So, there isn't one good outcome, except that I think everybody started with a different flavor. We developed 4 scenarios. Everyone that we talked to had a different place that they started, and everyone had a moment where I could just see their eyes widen, where they went, oh, my favorite is really bad for some other things. So, one of our partners, for example, was the local Chamber of Commerce, who loved the development scenario until they realized that most people move away after 30 years because they don't like it. They move there for recreation and then they move away and think, oh, okay, there's things I have to think about. So I think it's useful for that. For scaling up, what we're doing right now, actually, what I'm doing right now when I'm not giving this talk, is trying to write a proposal to develop a network of landscapes across Canada who are doing exactly this, and not just in agriculture, but in forestry and mining and fisheries, to try to see what are the generalizable principles that we could learn from this, both in terms of management, but also just in terms of what should we be monitoring in all of these landscapes if we want to aim for these kinds of solutions? I don't think we don't know at all. So hopefully they'll give me some money and I could do it. Yeah, Steve.
Thanks, Elena. That was great. Steve Pulaski, University of Minnesota. One thing I'd love to hear a little bit more you talk about is when you're working with the mayors and the people on the ground. I mean, this is great work if you're actually trying to get stuff done. It's also, from science perspectives, can be really frustrating, right? So the political scale or the political speed and the academic speed and what people are interested in and how you have to work through it. Anyway, if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, yeah, so the speeds are just all wrong, right? There were times when we were going too fast and they were moving really slow, and there were times when when the opposite. I forget where I started, but there was never a time where I felt like the pace was right for everybody. It was constantly this back and forth that was really complicated. I mean, that election in the middle of the whole thing was like oh my God, now what am I going to do? Because we're going to have new people. And not only do we need to bring them up to speed, we need their buy-in to even continue with this project. We had an amazing boundary organization in the local nature center, which shares property with a McGill field site. And so they really understood science, they understood the pace of science, they understood the need of the graduate students to have projects that they could publish, and they understood the politics. They'd been working in the community for 30 years or more, intimately involved in the politics. And just an example of one of the things that they did when this election came up, and we don't have 2 parties in Quebec, right? We have like 12 parties. So they went out to all of the mayoral candidates for every one of the elections and got their buy-in to this project before the election happened. So they were just amazing at being able to bridge that and translate that, which was super helpful, which isn't to say that it wasn't frustrating, because there were many moments of, just tearing my hair out at frustration about pacing or decision-making or whatever it was. But they're balanced by, I had 2 years of, we have a agricultural producers union, of, the agricultural producers union guy sort of being forced to be in the meeting and sitting there like this and being really angry. And then, about 2.5 years into what was a 4-year project, he kind of went, oh, this is actually really useful for me. And the sort of light went on, and you're not trying to take our land away or tell us what to do. And so, I think there were moments of just joy of bringing people together, and not so much me having anything to do with it, but just them, the stakeholders, having conversations that they don't normally have a chance to have, and working things out, and realizing that there were solutions that could move them forward to things that were beneficial for everyone.
Monica Turner, Wisconsin. You mentioned that you haven't done a lot with climate change, and I wonder if you have talked with your landowners and your stakeholders about what things look like in the future, or if not, how you might proceed about how well these flower diagrams and the balances can be sustained as things really change.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We have talked a little bit about that because our scenarios go out to, I'm trying to remember if they're 2025 or 2030. And of course, we have the historical that goes back to 1970. So we're able to see how non-static the landscape is. Even looking into the past, for example, things that were trade-offs in the 1970s are not trade-offs in the 2000s, because you get changes in management. So you get, for example, a trade-off between hunting and animal production in the 1970s when animals were kept outside in pastures that completely disappears by the 2000s when all the animals are indoors and they're no longer competing with deer for food. So we're able to point out, that there is potential for major shifts as management changes or as climate changes around them. And they're, I would say they're aware, but maybe a little, they're not sure what to do, right? What exactly they're going to do. And I would say, I think they're much more pushed by government policy towards decision-making than by climate. So when, for example, the U.S. changes its trade agreements, and now all of a sudden we're going to have, 10 times the milk that's produced in Quebec is going to flow into Quebec from the U.S., that's a much bigger influence than any concern about climate. So I'm not sure that they're there yet to even being able to think about that, except if we come from the top down to the policymakers and say, how can you change policy to push in a direction that makes people think about this?
Chris Field. I wonder if you could say a few things about the resourcing for the project that you described. I mean, it seems to me that one of the fundamental problems we face is that the stakeholders who are interested in recreation are different than the stakeholders who are interested in water quality, and they're different from the stakeholders who are interested in climate. And I didn't get a feel for whether the changes that you were describing really required financing, and whether there was some structure by which different stakeholders were able to participate in providing the financing and modifying it.
Yeah, so financing, not for the project, but for the actual restoration, is coming from the Quebec government through essentially a Quebec granting agency that deals with climate change. And they, before we even started with this project, they had put multiple millions of dollars on the table and said, we want you to use this for restoring forests. So there wasn't really an issue of finding funding. There was really an issue of deciding what's the best use of that funding, given, like you said, that we have these different stakeholders with different interests. And so getting all of those folks around the table to say, what are the trade-offs we're willing to make as we use this money in terms of costs and benefits or services that we want versus services that we're willing to forgo. Can I take one more? Oscar.
Just a quick comment and then a question, a very specific one. So thanks for the response to Natalie's question. I think it was a really good illustration of my point towards the end of yesterday evening around trade-offs, where it's not so easy to find a single best solution for everyone. And you have to have this kind of negotiated conversation about what's good for some people might not be so great for others, what's good for some services might not be so great for others, and we've got to then come to a settled outcome. I can see the red light flashing, so I'll quickly ask my question. The flower diagrams, did you have some kind of iterative process of consultation with people to decide which services were represented on the flower?
Yeah, so that was part of that first year of figuring out the questions, was deciding what was going to be on that flower, but really strongly influenced by what we could measure and get information about. Unfortunately, we're really limited by just what we could manage to do at this particular scale in a way that made sense. Yeah. Good. Thanks.